In June of 1972, a man named Philippe Petit stood on the roof of the World Trade Center with something absurd in his hands. A steel cable stretched between two towers still unfinished, suspended above the void of New York City. 8 times he walked across that wire. No safety harness, no net, nothing between him and death except balance, repetition, and a decision already made. The police waiting to arrest him later described something unsettling. He did not look reckless. He did not look euphoric. He looked calm, focused, almost intimate with danger. What made this moment extraordinary was not the height. It was the invisible battle that happened long before he stepped onto the wire. The real crossing had already happened in private. In months of planning, in repeated rehearsals, in the decision to keep moving despite the body screaming to stop. Most people imagine courage as an emotional state, a sudden surge of confidence, a heroic mood. But real courage rarely feels cinematic. It often feels mechanical, quiet, unromantic, a body flooded with tension, a mind manufacturing reasons to postpone, 1,000 internal alarms pretending to be wisdom. And yet, there is a strange fact hidden inside moments like this. The people capable of extraordinary action are not always the ones who feel the least fear. Sometimes they are simply the ones who have stopped negotiating with it. That is what makes this story disturbing, because the distance between an ordinary life and a radically different one is often not talent, intelligence, or luck. Sometimes, it is just the ability to remain in contact with discomfort for a few seconds longer than yesterday. The human mind has a peculiar obsession with protection. It is constantly scanning for threats, not only physical ones, but social and emotional ones. Humiliation, rejection, failure, exposure, the possibility of being seen as incompetent, unwanted, naive, weak. Long before any real danger appears, the system activates. A conversation is delayed. A message remains unsent. A project is postponed until motivation magically arrives. A decision is left suspended in endless analysis. On the surface, these choices look harmless, rational even, waiting for a better moment, more certainty, more clarity, more confidence. But something invisible is happening underneath. Every avoided discomfort teaches a lesson, not consciously, not verbally, but biologically. The body learns through consequences, not philosophy. Avoid discomfort, feel immediate relief. And relief is persuasive. Relief feels like intelligence, like safety, like self-preservation. But relief can be deceptive, because what feels like protection in the short term can become confinement over time. A life does not usually collapse through one dramatic act of cowardice. It contracts through repetition. One avoided conversation, one abandoned attempt, one excuse repeated until it hardens into identity. Then, years later, many people look around at the architecture of their own lives and cannot explain why everything feels smaller than it once did. Not because they chose pain, but because they made an unconscious religion out of avoiding it. And the cruelest part is this. The prison rarely feels like prison while it is being built. It feels reasonable, comfortable, even responsible, until one day, what was once self-protection begins to resemble self-erasure. What appears to be lack of discipline is often something far older and more primitive. Not laziness, not lack of ambition, not weakness, a threat response, a nervous system making calculations beneath awareness, estimating probabilities of pain, predicting emotional cost, asking one silent question over and over. Is this worth the risk of suffering? This changes everything, because many people spend years attacking themselves for patterns they do not understand. They call themselves procrastinators, quitters, overthinkers, unreliable, but labels explain behavior no better than shadows explain architecture. Beneath these patterns is often something more precise, an organism optimized to minimize emotional injury, to avoid shame, to avoid exposure, to avoid discovering an unbearable possibility that effort may not guarantee acceptance, success, or love. This is why certain fears feel irrationally large. They are rarely about the event itself. The difficult conversation is not just a conversation. The rejected invitation is not just rejection. The failed attempt is not just failure. Each becomes symbolic evidence in a private trial about personal worth. And when action is unconsciously linked to identity threat, hesitation begins to feel like survival. This is the mechanism most people never see, not because it is hidden from them, but because it is disguised as personality. What you are about to uncover is not merely why people avoid pain. It is how avoidance quietly reorganizes behavior, identity, relationships, ambition, and even the scale of a human life. There is a paradox at the center of emotional survival. The mind seeks certainty before action, but certainty is often the very thing action creates. So the person waits to feel ready, waits to feel fearless, waits until doubt disappears, waits for a version of themselves untouched by vulnerability, and in doing so, remains suspended in a loop with no natural exit, because the conditions being demanded internally cannot be met in advance. Confidence is not usually granted before action. Clarity is not usually granted before movement. Emotional permission rarely arrives as a gift. It is generated through contact, through friction, through repeated exposure to what once felt intolerable. This is the cruel architecture of avoidance. The very behaviors meant to reduce suffering can quietly guarantee its continuation. Not dramatic suffering, something more corrosive, a low-grade erosion of self-respect, a life partially lived, potential converted into imagination, desire transformed into fantasy because reality felt too emotionally expensive. And so the uncomfortable question emerges. What if the real danger in your life is not rejection, not embarrassment, not failure, but the possibility that your identity has been shaped more by what you avoid than by what you pursue? If that is true, then one question becomes impossible to escape. How much of what you call yourself is actually just accumulated avoidance? The question seems deceptively simple. Why does a behavior repeat? In the early decades of the 20th century, Burrhus Frederick Skinner became obsessed with that question. Not with morality, intention, or meaning, but with consequence. Inside controlled laboratory environments, Skinner designed what later became known as the Skinner box, a chamber built to isolate behavior and make its logic visible. Rats and pigeons were placed inside these boxes, where specific actions produced predictable consequences. A lever is pressed, pellet appears, behavior increases. The mechanism looks almost insultingly simple. But beneath this simplicity was a brutal insight. Organisms are not shaped primarily by abstract ideas. They are shaped by what follows action. Not what they say they value, not what they consciously believe, but what behavior produces. Skinner's work demonstrated something radical for its time. Behavior could be strengthened through reinforcement. Reward something and it becomes more likely. This part feels intuitive. But the deeper revolution was not only about pleasure. It was about relief. An organism does not need to gain something desirable in order to learn. Sometimes it only needs something unpleasant to stop. That distinction sounds small. It is not, because much of human life is not organized around chasing reward, but around escaping discomfort. Not seeking joy, seeking reduction of tension, reduction of uncertainty, reduction of fear. This is where the architecture of avoidance begins to reveal itself. A behavior repeated not because it creates growth, meaning, or progress, but because it briefly makes something unbearable go quiet. And when silence itself becomes rewarding, the mind starts learning lessons that can quietly shape an entire life. To understand the full force of this discovery, it is necessary to separate two concepts most people confuse. Positive reinforcement is straightforward. A behavior is followed by something desirable. Food, comfort, tension, approval. The organism learns. Do this again. Negative reinforcement sounds similar, but it is governed by a completely different emotional economy. It is not about receiving pleasure. It is about removing discomfort. A behavior occurs. An unpleasant stimulus disappears. The organism experiences relief. The behavior strengthens. Not because it felt good, because it felt less bad. This is one of the most misunderstood forces in human psychology. Skinner and later behavioral researchers demonstrated that removing an aversive condition can be just as powerful, sometimes more powerful, than introducing a reward. The absence of pain can function as reinforcement. That sentence should feel unsettling, because it means relief itself can train behavior with extraordinary efficiency. Not through celebration, through subtraction. Pressure disappears, anxiety decreases, tension lowers, threat recedes, and the nervous system registers the sequence. Do behavior, discomfort stops. Repeat. The elegance of the mechanism is precisely what makes it dangerous. Nothing dramatic is required. No grand trauma. No visible collapse. Only repetition. A pattern repeated enough times that it becomes automatic. Eventually, behavior no longer feels chosen. Feels natural, logical, part of who you are. When people say, "I'm just not the kind of person who does that," they often imagine they are describing identity. Sometimes they are simply describing a reinforcement history, a biography written not by conscious decisions, but by accumulated moments of relief. Seen through this lens, avoidance stops looking irrational. It becomes mathematically predictable. Imagine a person about to initiate a difficult conversation. Heart rate increases, stomach tightens, mind begins forecasting humiliation, conflict, rejection. The discomfort rises. Then a choice appears. Delay the conversation. Postpone the confrontation. Say nothing. Instantly, the body softens. Tension decreases. Threat seems to dissolve. Nothing external has improved. The problem remains exactly where it was. And yet, internally, something powerful has happened. Relief, a measurable reduction in discomfort. The nervous system does not evaluate long-term consequences in this moment. It detects immediate outcomes. Action avoided, discomfort reduced. Repeat. This is negative reinforcement operating in ordinary life. Not in laboratories, not in theory. Inside relationships, careers, ambitions, health, creativity, self-respect. Every escape becomes a lesson, not a philosophical lesson, a biological one. Avoidance works, at least temporarily, and temporary success is often enough to install a pattern. This is why self-sabotage is rarely experienced as sabotage in real time. It feels intelligent, strategic, protective. A person does not usually think, "I am reinforcing my fear circuitry." They think, "I'll do it later." This is how entire behavioral systems can develop invisibly, not through catastrophic decisions, but through tiny acts of emotional retreat rewarded by immediate relief. A machine does not care whether a behavior serves your future. It only cares what reduced discomfort fastest. And under that logic, many of the habits people call personality are simply efficient escape routes. This is where the mechanism becomes existential. A single act of avoidance is rarely life-defining, but repeated reinforcement changes probability. And probability, repeated long enough, begins to resemble fate. A child avoids raising a hand in class after one embarrassing moment. Relief follows. A teenager avoids vulnerability after rejection. Relief follows. An adult delays difficult risks, career changes, boundaries, intimacy, visibility. Relief follows. Different ages, different contexts, same architecture. Pattern is not built from intention. It is built from repetition plus consequence. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. The person no longer merely avoids isolated situations. They begin constructing an identity compatible with avoidance. Safer goals, smaller ambitions, controlled environments, predictable relationships. A life calibrated not around expansion, but around minimizing emotional disturbance. And because the strategy often reduces immediate suffering, it can masquerade as wisdom for years. No alarm sounds. No external authority intervenes. The prison is self-maintaining, quiet, efficient, rewarded. This is what makes Skinner's insight so disturbing. The same laws capable of shaping adaptive behavior can also help explain why human beings voluntarily cooperate with their own limitation. Not because they consciously choose smaller lives, but because smaller lives often contain fewer triggers. Less exposure, less uncertainty, less pain, at least at first. But what nobody warns you about is the hidden cost of becoming too skilled at escaping discomfort. There comes a point when what once protected you no longer feels like protection at all. But by then, the system may already be stronger than your intentions. If relief can shape behavior, a more disturbing question follows. What exactly is being reinforced when a person escapes fear? In 1947, psychologist O. Hobart Maurer proposed a model that would become foundational to understanding avoidance, the two-factor theory of avoidance learning. His work attempted to solve a puzzle behaviorists could not easily explain. If a fearful stimulus is absent, why does avoidance continue long after the original danger is gone? Why does a person keep escaping situations that are no longer objectively harmful? Maurer's answer was brutal in its simplicity. Fear begins through classical conditioning. A neutral event becomes associated with something aversive. A once ordinary stimulus is contaminated. A room, a tone, a face, a social context, possibility. Something harmless becomes emotionally charged through pairing with discomfort or threat. But conditioning alone could not explain persistence. Why does fear survive? Why does it often intensify? This is where Maurer introduced the second factor. Operant conditioning maintains the avoidance. The person escapes the feared stimulus. Anxiety decreases. Relief follows. Avoidance is reinforced. The organism learns not only that the feared object predicts danger, but that escape is effective. This creates a closed loop. Fear motivates avoidance. Avoidance reduces fear temporarily. Temporary reduction reinforces future avoidance. And each repetition strengthens the entire system. The implication is chilling. The feared situation does not need to remain dangerous in order to dominate behavior. It only needs to have once felt dangerous enough to install the association. After that, the machinery can sustain itself. A ghost no longer has to exist for someone to keep running from the room where they once believed they saw it. Maurer's theory was elegant because it explained something many people experience but rarely understand. Fear is often not sustained by confrontation with danger. It is sustained by the absence of confrontation. This is the paradox. The person believes avoidance is reducing fear. In reality, avoidance is preserving it. A feared stimulus remains psychologically unresolved because the organism never gathers corrective information. The feared event is never updated. The nervous system never learns what might have happened if contact had been maintained. This creates informational starvation. Person avoids public speaking, so they never discover whether embarrassment would actually occur. They avoid emotional honesty, so they never discover whether vulnerability would truly lead to rejection. They avoid difficult risks, so uncertainty remains permanently contaminated by imagination. Fear fills the vacuum, not because reality confirmed catastrophe, because reality was never allowed to intervene. The absence of disconfirmation becomes fuel. This is one of the most expensive misunderstandings in human life. People often believe time weakens fear. Sometimes time simply preserves it in sterile conditions. Untouched, unchallenged, protected from contradiction. Like a sealed organism never exposed to conditions that might kill it. Avoidance does not merely remove contact with discomfort. It removes access to reality. And without reality, imagination becomes sovereign. The mind begins constructing entire emotional worlds from prediction. Possible humiliation feels identical to certain humiliation. Possible rejection feels identical to inevitable rejection. Possible failure becomes pre-lived catastrophe. Under these conditions, the feared object gains psychological mass. Not because it changed, because distance allowed it to grow in darkness. This explains why certain fears feel strangely immortal. Not because they are rational, because they are maintained by a perfect system. Association creates alarm. Avoidance prevents correction. Relief rewards escape. The cycle closes. a self-protective structure is born. And once installed, it can begin expanding far beyond its original trigger. A person once humiliated in one environment may begin avoiding many. Not only the original setting, anything that resembles it, anything adjacent to it, anything remotely capable of reproducing the same emotional signature. This is how behavioral maps shrink. Not through one catastrophic prohibition. Through generalization, the perimeter widens. What was once a single avoided experience becomes a category, then a lifestyle. The logic is brutally efficient. If one situation produced pain, similar situations become suspect. Safer to avoid broadly, safer to reduce exposure, safer to minimize risk. At first, this appears adaptive, strategic even, but the strategy quietly expands until the individual is no longer avoiding one threat. They are organizing life around anticipated discomfort. And anticipation is infinitely expandable. Reality has boundaries. Prediction does not. This is why fear can colonize territory it has never actually visited. A person can become imprisoned by events that never occurred. Not because the mind is irrational, but because it is behaving according to learned rules that once served immediate survival. The tragedy is not the existence of fear. It is the efficiency with which fear can recruit intelligence itself into protecting the system that keeps it alive. Once this pattern is understood, something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. Avoidance is not passive. It is active training. Every retreat is an instruction. Every escape is a rehearsal. Every refusal to remain in contact with discomfort teaches the nervous system a lesson about what must be feared. The system does not ask whether the lesson is accurate, only whether it was reinforced. This is why fear can become increasingly convincing over time. Not because evidence accumulated, because contact disappeared. The person mistakes intensification for confirmation. It feels more frightening now, so it must be more dangerous. But intensity is not evidence. Sometimes intensity is simply what happens when fear is never metabolized. Left untouched, it compounds. Protected from exposure, it matures. Denied contradiction, it hardens into truth. Eventually, the person no longer remembers where the pattern began. Only that entire categories of experience now feel loaded with invisible danger. This is the cruelty of avoidance learning. Can erase its own origins. A prison whose walls become so familiar they are mistaken for geography. A limitation experienced not as limitation, but as preference, as identity, as reality itself. And this raises a far darker possibility. What if many of the fears that seem most personal, most intimate, most fundamentally you, were not born from who you are at all, but from patterns repeated so consistently that they became indistinguishable from your own mind? Before a person can explain fear, the body has often already learned it. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson and his graduate student Rosalie Rayner conducted one of the most controversial experiments in the history of behavioral psychology at Johns Hopkins University. Their subject was an infant known as Little Albert. Albert was approximately 9 months old when researchers first observed him interacting with a series of neutral objects. A white laboratory rat, a rabbit, a dog, cotton wool, masks, burning newspapers. The child showed no natural fear toward the white rat. He touched it, reached for it, explored it with visible curiosity. This detail matters, because it established something essential. The object itself was initially emotionally neutral. There was no built-in terror. No instinctive aversión. No inherited alarm. Only contact. Only perception. Only experience in its unconditioned form. This is what made the next phase so psychologically consequential. Watson was attempting to demonstrate a radical claim. Not merely that emotions could be observed, but that fear itself could be engineered, constructed, installed. If this were true, it would imply something deeply unsettling. That many emotional reactions people experience as deeply personal, irrational, or mysterious may not originate from inherent truth. They may be learned, acquired through association. written onto the nervous system through repeated pairing between neutral experience and aversive consequence. The implications reached far beyond the laboratory. Because if fear can be artificially created where none previously existed, then what people call instinct is not always instinct at all. Sometimes it is history masquerading as nature. The procedure was disturbingly simple. Each time Albert reached toward or touched the white rat, Watson created a sudden loud noise by striking a steel bar with a hammer behind the child. The sound was sharp, startling, aversive, an unconditioned stimulus, naturally capable of producing distress. Albert cried, startled violently, displayed visible fear responses. This sequence was repeated. Rat appears, contact begins, sound erupts, distress follows, again and again. Nothing mystical was occurring. No symbolic interpretation, no verbal instruction, no conscious reasoning, only association, a neutral object repeatedly paired with an aversive event. Eventually, something changed. The sound was removed. The rat was presented alone. No amer, no noise, no objective threat. And yet Albert reacted with fear. He withdrew, cried, attempted to crawl away. The emotional response had transferred. What was once neutral had become contaminated. The body had learned a new equation. White rat equals danger. Not through logic, not through explanation, through pairing. This is the terrifying elegance of conditioning. The organism does not need to understand why something feels threatening. It only needs sufficient repeated association. The nervous system stores patterns long before language can organize them, long before reflection, long before narrative. This means an emotional reaction can feel immediate, total, and self-evident, while remaining completely disconnected from present reality. A body can react as though danger is obvious, even when the threat exists only as a learned echo from prior experience. The most unsettling part did not end with the rat. Fear began to generalize. After conditioning, Albert showed distress not only toward the white rat, but toward other similar stimuli. A white rabbit, a fur coat, cotton wool, even a Santa Claus mask with white beard-like features. The original object was no longer the only trigger. Resemblance became enough. Similarity became suspicious. Association had spread. This matters because it reveals something profound about human emotional life. Fear does not always remain confined to its point of origin. Once installed, it can begin attaching itself to adjacent stimuli. Not because those new stimuli are dangerous, because they share features with something previously linked to discomfort. This is how emotional landscapes become distorted. The nervous system does not ask for philosophical nuance. It searches for patterns, texture, shape, tone, context. Similarity becomes proxy, and from there, entire categories can become emotionally loaded. A single painful experience can begin radiating outward, not in straight lines, in expanding circles, until a person no longer reacts only to what harmed them. They react to what resembles harm. This is one reason irrational fears feel so convincing. They are not random. They are structured, ordered, built according to rules beneath awareness. A person may insist, "I know this makes no sense," and still feel the reaction with full physiological intensity. Because the body is not waiting for intellectual permission. It is executing a program learned through contact, sometimes long before the conscious mind was ever invited to participate. What makes this experiment endure in psychological history is not merely its controversy. It is what it exposes. The mind likes to believe emotions are transparent, that if something feels dangerous, there must be a good reason, that internal alarm signals correspond neatly to external truth. But conditioned fear disrupts that illusion. It reveals that emotional certainty is not always evidence. Sometimes it is residue, a present tense reaction generated by past tense learning. The body can carry instructions the mind does not remember writing. And because those instructions feel immediate and embodied, they are often mistaken for intuition, for instinct, for reality. This is how neutral experiences can become loaded with invisible charge. Not because something objectively changed in the world. Because the nervous system changed its interpretation. A harmless cue becomes psychologically electrified. An ordinary stimulus becomes a private warning sign. The person feels the reaction and assumes the object contains the threat. Often, the threat is not in the object at all. It is in the association. This distinction is subtle enough to go unnoticed for years, sometimes for an entire life. A person can spend decades avoiding something that was never inherently dangerous, only emotionally marked. Not imprisoned by the object itself, but by what their body once learned to predict. And once you understand how easily fear can be installed, another question begins to emerge with uncomfortable force. If so much can be written into the nervous system without consent, how much of what feels deeply personal was never consciously chosen in the first place? If fear can be learned without conscious permission, another unsettling possibility appears. What if some of the most painful experiences in human life are treated by the brain not as metaphorical wounds, but as actual threats to survival? In 2003, psychologist Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues at UCLA investigated a question many had long dismissed as poetic exaggeration. Does social rejection literally hurt? Not emotionally in the vague and abstract sense people often describe. Biologically, neurologically, inside the architecture of the brain itself. To test this, researchers used a deceptively simple experimental task called cyberball. Participants entered an fMRI scanner and were told they would be playing a virtual ball-tossing game with two other players. The setup was intentionally mundane. No dramatic stakes. No public humiliation. No catastrophic conflict. Only a basic social interaction designed to simulate inclusion. At first, the participant received the ball regularly. A predictable rhythm was established. Ball thrown. Ball received. Participation confirmed. Presence acknowledged. Nothing extraordinary. But beneath this simplicity was an ancient psychological substrate. Humans are profoundly social organisms. For most of evolutionary history, belonging was not merely emotionally pleasant. It was protective. To remain inside the group increased chances of safety, access to resources, reproduction, survival. Exclusion carried consequences far more severe than discomfort. Isolation could mean vulnerability, exposure, death. The modern nervous system still carries traces of that history. And cyberball was about to expose just how little distance exists between social experience and biological alarm. Then the pattern changed. The participant stopped receiving the ball. At first, the interruption seemed temporary, a minor irregularity, perhaps accidental, but the exclusion continued. The other two players passed the ball only to each other. The participant watched, waited, remained present, but functionally erased. No explicit insult was delivered. No criticism. No verbal rejection. No explanation. Nothing dramatic enough to justify emotional intensity. And yet something significant occurred. Participants consistently reported distress. Feelings of exclusion. Loss of belonging. Threatened self-esteem. A sense of being ignored, dismissed, cut off from social participation. This alone was already revealing, but the brain imaging data made the experiment historically important. During social exclusion, researchers observed activation in brain regions including the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, areas previously implicated in the processing of physical pain and distress. This finding suggested something profound. The brain may partially process social rejection using overlapping neural systems involved in physical threat. Not identical systems in every respect, but sufficiently related to support an extraordinary conclusion. Social pain is not merely a poetic label. The experience recruits biological machinery associated with suffering. This helps explain something people often misunderstand about themselves. Why being ignored can feel disproportionately painful. Why exclusion can linger in memory with surprising intensity. Why a text message unanswered, an invitation withheld, or emotional coldness can trigger reactions that feel embarrassingly large. The response is not always immaturity. Sometimes it is ancient circuitry interpreting social rupture as danger. This changes how rejection must be understood. People often treat fear of rejection as vanity, fragility, excessive sensitivity, a character flaw to outgrow. But cyberball exposed a less flattering reality. The aversion to exclusion is not merely cultural conditioning or ego preference. It is deeply embodied. The organism reacts as though something consequential is at stake. Because for most of human history, something was. To be pushed outside the social structure was not psychologically inconvenient. It was materially dangerous. A person separated from the tribe faced exposure to environmental threat, predation, scarcity, diminished protection. Belonging was regulation. Connection was infrastructure. This evolutionary residue remains embedded in contemporary behavior, which means many modern fears are operating on ancient code. A person hesitates to speak honestly in a meeting, not because the meeting is lethal, but because social risk activates systems not designed for office politics. A teenager fears humiliation online, not because a digital comment section determines survival, but because public exclusion still interfaces with deeply conserved threat circuitry. This is why emotional pain can feel irrationally large compared to the apparent trigger. The trigger is modern. The system interpreting it is older, much older. This gap creates enormous confusion. A person judges themselves for overreacting, for caring too much, for being unable to just move on, without realizing their nervous system is not calibrated according to intellectual logic. It is calibrated according to evolutionary priorities. And among those priorities, social belonging has always occupied privileged status. To risk exclusion is not registered as trivial. It is registered as potential danger wearing contemporary clothing. Seen clearly, much of human avoidance begins to look less mysterious. Not weaker, not more pathetic, more biological. A person avoids difficult honesty because rejection is costly, avoids vulnerability because exclusion hurts, avoids visibility because public evaluation carries social stakes the nervous system still treats seriously. This does not mean avoidance is adaptive in every context, only that its emotional logic is older than conscious reasoning. The system is not asking, will this help me become the person I want to become? It is often asking something far simpler. Will this preserve belonging? Will this reduce risk of disconnection? Will this protect me from social pain? This is why people sometimes betray their own goals in order to maintain acceptance. Stay silent when truth is needed. Remain small when expansion risks judgment. Choose invisibility over exposure, not because they lack desire, but because belonging can feel neurologically more urgent than self-expression. And here lies the quiet cruelty. The very adaptations once designed to preserve connection can eventually sever a person from themselves. Safety is purchased through self-editing, approval through contraction, belonging through strategic disappearance. At first, this seems harmless, even intelligent, until a person begins noticing an unbearable pattern. They are still accepted, still included, still socially intact. And yet, somewhere underneath all that adaptation, something essential has started to vanish. There is a quieter threat than rejection. Not being excluded by others, but being forced into confrontation with a version of yourself you do not want to see. In 1988, social psychologist Claude Steele introduced what became known as self-affirmation theory. His work began from a psychologically uncomfortable assumption. Human beings are deeply motivated to preserve a sense of self-integrity. Not perfection, not superiority, something more subtle. The belief that one is fundamentally adequate, competent, moral, coherent. A person capable of regarding themselves as acceptable. This internal structure is more fragile than it appears, because everyday life constantly presents information capable of threatening it. Failure can threaten competence. Criticism can threaten worth. Contradiction can threaten consistency. Evidence can threaten identity. A person likes to imagine they seek truth. Often, they seek psychological continuity. Steele's theory proposed that when people encounter information suggesting something destabilizing about themselves, they do not respond neutrally. They enter defense, not always loudly, not always consciously, sometimes with remarkable sophistication. The threat does not need to involve physical danger or public humiliation. It can be entirely internal, a challenge to self-concept, a signal that who you believe yourself to be may be incomplete, flawed, mistaken, morally compromised, or less exceptional than preferred. This creates a uniquely human form of avoidance, not avoiding pain in the external sense, avoiding identity injury, protecting the psychological architecture that allows a person to wake up each morning and continue believing a coherent story about themselves. Sometimes that story becomes more important than reality itself. Steele's experiments explored what happens when this internal integrity is threatened. Across multiple studies, participants were exposed to information or situations capable of activating defensiveness. Sometimes they received feedback challenging competence. Sometimes they confronted information implying moral inconsistency or personal inadequacy. The interesting part was not simply discomfort. It was what happened next. When self-integrity felt threatened, individuals became motivated to restore it, not necessarily by solving the original issue, not by immediate behavioral correction, but by protecting the broader self-system. One of Steele's most influential findings was that people became less defensive when given opportunities to affirm alternative valued aspects of themselves. Participants might reflect on personally important values: family, creativity, relationships, spirituality, honesty, achievement. By reinforcing another dimension of identity, the threatened self-system became less brittle, less reactive, more capable of tolerating threatening information. This was psychologically revealing. It suggested that people often resist uncomfortable truths not because they are incapable of reason, but because certain information feels globally destabilizing. A threat in one domain can feel like contamination of the whole self. A professional failure does not remain a professional failure. It mutates into evidence of inadequacy. A criticism does not remain criticism. It becomes indictment. A mistake does not remain localized. It spreads into identity. Under these conditions, avoidance becomes highly understandable. The person is not merely avoiding an unpleasant event. They are avoiding data capable of destabilizing the story holding their identity together. This helps explain a behavior many people misinterpret as simple procrastination. Sometimes delay is not about laziness. It is psychological self-protection. A person postpones applying for the opportunity they claim to want, not because they do not care, because rejection would generate information. Information about competence, worth, status, potential. An exam is avoided. Feedback is delayed. A difficult conversation remains unsent, not because the action itself is unbearable, because the possible implications feel too expensive. What if the result confirms something feared? What if effort reveals limits? What if exposure punctures the identity narrative currently preserving internal stability? This is why people can become strangely loyal to uncertainty. Uncertainty is painful, but it preserves possibility. As long as the result remains unknown, identity remains negotiable. Failure is not yet final. Inadequacy is not yet proven. The fantasy version of the self survives untouched. Action threatens that. Reality threatens that. Measurement threatens that. This creates an extraordinary psychological conflict. People can simultaneously crave growth and avoid the very situations required to obtain accurate information about themselves. Not because they lack ambition, but because growth often demands contact with evidence that identity is incomplete. And incompleteness feels threatening to systems built around maintaining coherence. The mind will often prefer an unfinished fantasy over a finished wound. Seen clearly, much of avoidance is not fear of external pain. It is fear of self-revision, the possibility that reality may demand an update to the story you tell yourself. A smaller story, a more complicated one, a less flattering one. This is psychologically expensive, Because identity is not a decorative accessory. It is regulatory architecture. It organizes behavior, expectations, decisions, emotional prediction. Threaten it, and the entire system can destabilize. This is why people can cling to narratives that no longer serve them. Not because those narratives are accurate, because they are stabilizing. A person may continue believing they are not ready, not the type, not talented enough, or still figuring things out, not always as objective descriptions, sometimes as protective structures. As long as the story remains intact, deeper confrontation can be postponed. The cost is subtle. Time passes, possibilities narrow, behavior contracts around image maintenance. A life becomes partially organized around preserving an internal reputation, not necessarily among others, with oneself. And here lies the hidden cruelty. The self people are trying hardest to protect can slowly become the very thing preventing expansion. An identity defended too rigidly eventually functions like armor worn beneath the skin. Protective, restrictive, difficult to remove. And after enough years, one question begins to feel almost unbearable. How much of your life has been shaped not by who you are, but by what you have been unwilling to discover about yourself? There is a stage beyond fear, more dangerous, more silent, a condition in which the organism no longer runs, resists, or even searches for escape. Not because the threat disappeared, because the expectation of control did. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman and colleagues conducted a series of experiments that would become foundational in understanding helplessness and behavioral surrender. The studies involved dogs exposed to aversive electric shocks under different conditions. Some animals could terminate the shocks through an action. They retained contingency. Cause and effect remained intact. Action mattered. Other dogs experienced something different. They were exposed to shocks they could not control. No behavior altered the outcome. No movement stopped the discomfort. No signal predicted relief. The organism was trapped in a brutal psychological equation. Pain without influence. Discomfort without agency. Experience without effective response. This distinction was not trivial. It transformed the meaning of suffering. An organism can tolerate extraordinary difficulty when action appears consequential. What destabilizes behavior more deeply is not pain alone. It is pain combined with futility, the experience that nothing you do changes what happens. No strategy works. No effort matters. No exit response. This is where something begins to fracture. Not the body first, the expectation system, the internal model linking action to consequence. And once that model begins to collapse, behavior changes in ways more disturbing than fear itself. Because an organism that believes action is irrelevant becomes vulnerable to a different kind of paralysis altogether. The most historically significant moment came later. After this initial exposure, the dogs were placed inside a shuttle box divided by a low barrier. On one side, electric shocks could be delivered. But now something crucial had changed. Escape was possible. The animal could simply jump over the barrier to the other side and terminate the shock. A physically accessible exit existed. The path to relief was no longer hidden. No sophisticated reasoning required. Only movement. And yet many of the previously uncontrollable dogs did not escape. They did not even attempt to. They lay down, whined, endured, passively receiving discomfort despite available freedom. This is what made the findings psychologically devastating. The barrier was low. The solution was real. The exit was present. But prior experience had altered expectation. The organism had learned something. Not a motor skill. Not a factual rule. A belief-like pattern. That action does not matter. Once installed, this expectation suppressed behavior even when reality had changed. The environment was no longer fully trapping the organism. The organism was carrying the trap internally. This is learned helplessness. Not simply exposure to hardship, but adaptation to uncontrollability. A nervous system trained to stop searching, to stop testing, to stop initiating escape behavior. Not because escape is impossible, because impossibility has been psychologically inferred. This is where surrender becomes most dangerous. Not when there are no options, but when options exist and no longer feel worth trying. This pattern extends far beyond laboratory conditions. It offers a brutal lens through which to understand human surrender. A person may repeatedly encounter situations in which effort appears disconnected from outcome. Childhood environments where emotional needs go unanswered. Relationships where communication changes nothing. Institutions where competence is unrewarded. Attempts repeatedly met with indifference, chaos, punishment, or failure. Over time, something subtle can happen. Behavior begins to contract, not because motivation disappears in a vacuum, because the system updates. Trying feels inefficient. Hope feels metabolically expensive. Initiation becomes harder, not due to lack of intelligence or potential, due to learned expectation. This is why some people stop applying, stop asking, stop confronting, stop leaving, stop beginning. Not because they carefully evaluated all available options and concluded surrender was rational. Because repeated uncontrollability reshaped what options feel psychologically real. This creates one of the cruelest illusions in human behavior. From the outside, passivity can resemble apathy, laziness, low standards, lack of ambition, but often something far more tragic is occurring. The person is not merely inactive. They are behaving according to a nervous system that has partially stopped believing in contingency, stopped trusting that action meaningfully alters outcome. This makes recovery uniquely difficult, because the central problem is not absence of opportunity. It is damaged expectancy. Freedom can be present and still go behaviorally unused. This is why early surrender can become so convincing, not because the person consciously decides to abandon themselves, because the internal model governing effort has been altered. The calculation changes. Why invest energy if prior experience predicts irrelevance? Why risk disappointment if action historically failed to produce relief? Under these conditions, inaction begins to feel rational, protective, even intelligent. But there is a hidden cost. The world continues changing while the expectation system remains frozen in outdated probability. New exits appear. Different contexts emerge. More responsive people arrive. Alternative strategies become available. Yet the organism behaves as though nothing changed. This is how a person can become trapped by yesterday inside a present that no longer requires the same conclusions. Not imprisoned by objective impossibility, by learned anticipation of failure. And this is where the deepest tragedy appears. Many individuals spend years interpreting their own behavioral paralysis as evidence of personal deficiency, as proof they are weak, broken, fundamentally incapable, when in many cases the system is doing exactly what it was trained to do. Conserve energy under expected futility. The behavior makes sense. The suffering is real. But what remains most disturbing is this. Once the mind has learned that effort is useless, the greatest prison is no longer the original pain. It is the quiet conviction that no door is worth testing again. There is a form of avoidance more sophisticated than withdrawal, more deceptive, because from the outside, it can still resemble effort. The person appears engaged, present, trying, and yet, beneath the surface, something else is happening. A quiet construction of future excuses, a preemptive protection system. In 1978, psychologists Stephen Bergloss and Edward Jones introduced a concept that exposed one of the mind's most elegant defenses: self-handicapping. Their work examined what people do when facing a threatening possibility. Not merely failure, something often perceived as worse. Failure that reveals inadequacy. Failure that cannot be explained away. Failure interpreted as evidence of insufficient ability. This distinction is psychologically crucial. A person can tolerate disappointing outcomes more easily when an external explanation remains available. Bad luck, lack of sleep, poor timing, stress, distraction, illness, circumstance. But pure failure, unbuffered by excuse, contains informational threat. It implies something internal, something stable, something potentially diagnostic. Maybe I am not as capable as I hoped. Maybe the result reflects me. For many people, this is what must be avoided at all costs. Not defeat itself. Transparent defeat. Exposure without narrative protection. Self-handicapping emerges precisely here. It is the creation of obstacles, limitations, or impairments that can later serve as explanatory shields. A way to preserve identity in advance. To contaminate the test before the result arrives. So if the outcome is bad, the ego remains partially insulated. The performance failed, but the self can remain less conclusively judged. In one of their most influential studies, Berglos and Jones gave participants what they believed was an intelligence test. Afterward, participants received manipulated feedback. Some were told they had performed well on a difficult test. This success was meaningful. It implied ability, but it also created pressure. Future performance now carried stakes. A second test was coming, and with it, the risk of contradiction. The researchers then presented participants with a choice. Before the next task, they could select between two drugs. One was described as performance-enhancing. The other was described as impairing intellectual performance, reducing effectiveness, creating obstacles. The remarkable result was this. Participants who had reason to doubt whether their earlier success truly reflected ability were more likely to choose the performance-impairing option. This was psychologically astonishing. Why voluntarily choose something harmful before an evaluative task? Because the handicap served a strategic function. If they failed later, the explanation was available. Not lack of intelligence. Not exposed inadequacy. The drug interfered. The result had an alibi. This preserved something crucial. Interpretive ambiguity. The self remained less vulnerable to definitive negative judgment. Failure becomes less diagnostic when contaminated by prior disadvantage. This is the genius of self-handicapping. It allows the person to approach risk while partially protecting identity from clean measurement. A damaged result is often psychologically safer than a clear answer. Outside the laboratory, the behavior is less visible but everywhere. A person delays preparation until the final night, sleeps poorly before an important event, commits partially, arrives distracted, starts late, quits early, creates conditions under which performance becomes compromised. From the outside, this looks irrational, self-destructive, counterproductive, but psychologically it is often exquisitely logical. If the person fails under compromised conditions, the verdict remains blurred. The result cannot fully answer the most threatening question. What happens if I try completely and still prove insufficient? This is the fear beneath many forms of sabotage. Not effort, not challenge, clean evaluation, total exposure. To engage fully is to remove excuses. To remove excuses is to invite informational clarity. And clarity can be brutal. A person may prefer a controlled imperfection over uncontaminated measurement. Better to fail tired than fail fully prepared. Better to underperform while distracted than underperform without explanation. Better to quit before judgment than risk being accurately seen. This is how sabotage disguises itself as protection. It offers temporary emotional shelter, but at a hidden cost. The person never receives honest data. Not about limits, not about capacity, not about what would have happened under genuine commitment. Their life becomes populated by almost partial attempts, strategic underinvestment. Not because they fear action, because they fear what action might reveal. Seen clearly, self-handicapping is a negotiation with uncertainty, a bargain between ambition and self-protection. The person wants the possibility of success, but not at the price of definitive self-disclosure. So they preserve ambiguity, not fully in, not fully out, never entirely measurable. This can become a way of life. Projects initiated under compromised conditions. Relationships approached with one foot already retreating. Goals pursued with invisible emergency exits built into the structure. Enough effort to preserve hope. Not enough to risk exposure. This creates a strange emotional landscape. The individual remains haunted by potential, not fulfilled by achievement, not humbled by clear limitation, suspended, protected from devastating certainty, but also blocked from meaningful evidence. And here lies the cruelty. A person can spend years believing they are protecting self-worth while systematically preventing any honest encounter with it. The ego survives, but reality remains unfaced. Capacity remains untested. Identity remains padded by excuses carefully installed in advance. Eventually, a quieter question begins to emerge. Not whether you failed, not whether you succeeded, but whether you have ever truly allowed reality to answer who you are when nothing remains available to hide behind. If avoidance teaches the nervous system that fear was correct, then recovery requires something deeply counterintuitive. Not escape, contact, not reassurance, experience. Not the elimination of anxiety before action, but action while anxiety is still present. Across the 1980s and 1990s, psychologist Edna Foa became one of the most influential researchers in the treatment of anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress. Her work helped formalize what would become one of the most empirically supported interventions in clinical psychology: exposure therapy. Its logic is deceptively simple. A person repeatedly confronts what has been avoided, not recklessly, not chaotically, systematically, with sufficient duration and repetition. This was built upon an uncomfortable observation. Avoidance produces short-term relief, but relief is misinterpreted by the nervous system. Escape feels like proof that danger was real, proof that withdrawal was necessary, proof that survival depended on retreat. The feared stimulus remains unchallenged, untested, psychologically contaminated, and so fear is preserved, sometimes strengthened. Exposure therapy interrupts this loop. The person remains in contact with the feared object, thought, memory, or situation long enough for new learning to occur. The central mechanism is not courage as people romantically imagine it. It is corrective experience. The nervous system must discover, through repeated contact, that catastrophe does not unfold as predicted, or that discomfort, even when intense, is survivable without escape. This is not comforting. It is retraining through experience, a direct negotiation with the machinery of fear itself. Foa's work was especially influential in treating post-traumatic stress disorder. Patients suffering from trauma often organize behavior around avoidance, avoiding places, memories, conversations, sensations, images, anything capable of activating distress. This appears protective, but it preserves fragmentation. The traumatic memory remains psychologically sealed, unintegrated, surrounded by avoidance rituals that prevent emotional processing. Foa's prolonged exposure protocols invited patients to repeatedly revisit feared memories and avoided stimuli under controlled therapeutic conditions, to speak what had been unspeakable, to remain present with what had previously triggered escape, to allow the nervous system to encounter distress without immediate withdrawal. This was not easy, not symbolic, not purely cognitive. It required contact, repeated, structured confrontation with what the organism had classified as intolerable. Over time, something important could occur. Fear activation remained possible, but the meaning of activation changed. Distress no longer automatically predicted catastrophe. A painful memory could be activated without destroying the present. Anxiety could rise and fall without requiring ritualized escape. The body learned a new pattern. Activation does not equal annihilation. This distinction is psychologically revolutionary, because avoidance teaches one lesson: I survived because I escaped. Exposure teaches another: I survived even when I stayed. These are not minor differences in interpretation. They are competing models of reality installed into the nervous system. This principle extends far beyond clinical disorders. It maps directly onto ordinary human life. A difficult conversation avoided becomes more threatening. A decision postponed accumulates psychological charge. An unopened email grows heavier with each passing day. A feared social interaction becomes larger in imagination than in reality. The mechanism is consistent. Distance amplifies distortion.
Absence préservée fantaisie.
Avoidance prevents updating. Nothing corrects the prediction, so the prediction hardens. A person can spend months fearing an event that would produce only minutes of discomfort if actually confronted. Not because the threat is objectively enormous, because it has been nourished by non-contact, fed through imagination and protected by distance. Exposure disrupts this inflation, not by making discomfort disappear, but by restoring accurate calibration. The feared object becomes measurable again, finite, specific, located in reality rather than symbolic infinity. A conversation becomes a conversation, not identity collapse. A rejection becomes information, not total annihilation. An uncomfortable moment becomes an experience, not existential verdict. This is what repeated contact restores: proportion, reality testing, behavioral flexibility. The person no longer organizes life around avoiding internal activation at all costs. They begin recovering behavioral freedom from the dictatorship of anticipated discomfort. This is the paradox many resist most fiercely. Fear often does not shrink before contact. It shrinks because of contact. The nervous system is not persuaded by theory alone, not by intention, not by reassurance repeated in private thought. It updates through evidence, embodied evidence, behavioral proof gathered through lived contradiction. This means emotional readiness is frequently an illusion people wait for indefinitely, a threshold imagined but never reached. They tell themselves action will begin once confidence arrives, once anxiety decreases, once certainty appears. But exposure research points toward a harsher truth. In many cases, confidence is not the prerequisite. It is the byproduct, generated after repeated contact disproves catastrophic prediction. This makes healing less glamorous than most people hope, less inspirational, more mechanical, a slow re-education of expectation through voluntary encounters with discomfort. The person walks toward what had been avoided, again and again, not because fear is gone, because new evidence is needed. And here lies the uncomfortable freedom hidden inside the entire structure. Much of what governs a life is not decided by what a person feels in a moment, but by which experiences they repeatedly allow their nervous system to learn from. The question is no longer whether fear is present. The deeper question is this: what has your life been teaching your nervous system to believe every time you turn away? There is a cost to every identity, even the identities people never consciously choose. The cautious one, the agreeable one, the invisible one, the one who avoids conflict, risk, exposure, contradiction. These identities often feel accidental, as if they simply emerged from temperament or circumstance. But identity is frequently shaped less by what a person pursues than by what they repeatedly refuse to face. Every avoided conversation teaches something. Every abandoned attempt reinforces something. Every silence becomes instructional, not only behaviorally, existentially. A person is built through repetition, not merely repetition of action, but repetition of retreat. This is why avoidance is so expensive. Its damage is cumulative and mostly invisible.
No dramatic collapse. No cinematic catastrophe.
Only slow subtraction, a smaller range of choices, a narrower emotional tolerance, a shrinking map of what feels possible. At first, this reduction can feel like safety, cleaner life, less volatility, less humiliation, less uncertainty. But safety purchased through contraction has a hidden architecture. It gradually demands more territory. More things must be avoided to preserve equilibrium. More conversations become dangerous. More opportunities become threatening. More people become evaluative risks. Eventually, the person is no longer merely protecting themselves from pain. They are curating an increasingly fragile environment in which they can continue functioning without being psychologically activated. A life organized around minimizing internal disturbance can look calm from the outside. but underneath it often resembles captivity with elegant furniture. Many people assume suffering comes primarily from painful events: rejection, failure, loss, humiliation, exposure. But a different form of suffering often runs deeper: the suffering of unlived possibilities. Not what happened to you, what never happened because you systematically removed yourself from collision with reality. A conversation never initiated, a boundary never enforced, a talent never tested, a life direction never explored. This pain is uniquely corrosive because it lacks closure. A failed attempt ends. A rejected proposal ends. An embarrassing moment passes. But avoided realities remain psychologically open, unresolved. They linger as speculative ghosts, versions of self suspended in permanent ambiguity. Who might you have become if you had tolerated the discomfort long enough? There is no measurable answer, only imagination, and imagination is often crueler than reality. It can endlessly generate idealized alternate lives against which the present feels diminished. This creates a strange burden. A person can become haunted not by trauma alone, but by hypothetical selves abandoned through chronic avoidance. Not dead, not alive, just inaccessible, stored in imagination like sealed rooms no longer entered. This is one reason avoidance ages so poorly. Its short-term relief compounds into long-term existential weight. Not because life became unbearable, because too much of it remained untouched, untested, unentered, and what remains unlived does not disappear quietly, tends to echo. There is no life without emotional pain. This is not a motivational slogan. It is structural reality. To care is to risk loss. To attach is to risk grief. To speak honestly is to risk rejection. To act visibly is to risk embarrassment. To pursue anything meaningful is to repeatedly encounter uncertainty, inadequacy, and friction. Pain is not evidence of malfunction. It is evidence of participation. The mistake many people make is not wanting less pain. It is trying to arrange existence so pain arrives only on acceptable terms. Predictable, controlled, scheduled, sanitized. But life does not negotiate this way. Pain enters through unscripted doors, at inconvenient hours, in forms not requested. The attempt to engineer total emotional safety is therefore not merely unrealistic. It is behaviorally expensive, because every effort to eliminate vulnerability often requires eliminating exposure to what makes existence expansive in the first place. Love, risk, novelty, ambition, truth, intimacy,
Krisischen.
agency. The same openings through which meaning enters are often the openings through which pain arrives. This is the arrangement, not a flaw in the system, which means the question was never how to construct a painless existence. That project was impossible from the beginning. The more consequential question has always been narrower and more severe. What forms of pain are you willing to pay in exchange for a life that actually feels inhabited? At some point, every person is forced into a private confrontation, not with the world, with themselves, a moment often invisible to others. No audience,
No applause.
no witnesses capable of validating what happens next. Only a decision, whether to continue outsourcing the shape of your life to emotional weather, or to begin acting according to something deeper than immediate comfort. This is rarely dramatic. It does not always look heroic. Often it looks embarrassingly small. Sending the message, making the call, telling the truth, remaining present through discomfort without immediately anesthetizing it. Not because certainty has arrived, because certainty is no longer treated as an entry requirement for action. This is where agency begins to reappear, not as a feeling, as behavior, a sequence of movements that slowly become evidence. Evidence that fear can coexist with motion, that discomfort can coexist with direction, that emotional turbulence does not possess final authority over what becomes possible. No one can make this exchange for another person. No explanation can substitute for it. No amount of understanding removes the necessity of contact. Eventually, Every life is shaped by what it repeatedly chooses to approach or avoid. And in the end, existence becomes brutally simple. You do not become the person you imagine. You become the person your repeated decisions are willing to tolerate.